Last year, Google engineer James Damore published a memo about workplace diversity that led to his being fired by the online giant. The title of the 10-page document was Google's Ideological Echo Chamber, and one of the reasons he was let go was because he supposedly perpetuated gender stereotypes in his discussion. But the memo didn't just discuss gender issues. It also raised questions about Google's commitment to ideological diversity. Earlier this year, the Lincoln Network, a Bay Area group that works to bolster libertarian and conservative workers in the tech sector, published a survey on viewpoint diversity and cultural norms in Silicon Valley. The results are preliminary but stunning. In the wake of the Damore memo, for instance, about half of self-described moderates, 2/3 of libertarians, and 71% of very conservative respondents said they felt less comfortable sharing ideological viewpoints with their colleagues. Reason sat down with Lincoln Network co-founder Garrett Johnson to discuss his outfit's preliminary study, why it's bad to stifle ideological viewpoints in the tech world, and what it means that more survey respondents called themselves libertarian than any other term. What's the nut of the study?
I want to emphasize that it's a pilot study. We plan to do a much larger one capturing more data. The most important component of this data is that it didn't exist before we did it. This is the first of its kind. There are lots of companies that self-report data on ethnic diversity, gender diversity, sexual orientation, but no one is capturing data on viewpoint diversity.
Right, so ideological diversity.
Ideological diversity in the workplace.
You have about 356 respondents. Most men, I think it was like 80, basically 85,
70-30.
Yeah, okay.
So it was 387 respondents on the raw data, 70% technical, 30% non-technical, about 80% men, 20% women. Right. Across the political spectrum, a good distribution between very liberal and very conservative.
Right, and if I can just jump in, because this is Reason, I was kind of surprised and heartened to see that libertarian, and these were self-reported identifiers, but libertarian was the single largest identifier.
It was the single largest identifier, the middle, the moderate, and libertarian being the two largest.
So, and I realize this was self-reported, but on the very liberal, what kind of goes into that and what goes into the very conservative? Do you have a sense of, if somebody says they're very conservative, what do they believe?
So in addition to capturing that information, we also captured religious identity. And so usually the very conservative have a affinity to some type of religious identity. The majority of people who completed the survey, the largest category was atheist and agnostic. And that usually skewed towards a more very liberal or liberal.
Right. And now, part of this is coming out after the James Damore memo at Google, kind of chiding his former employer for caring about ethnic and gender diversity and sexual orientation, but not caring at all about ideological diversity. Some of the questions that you asked were things like, after the Damore kind of flap, do you worry about talking about politics in the workplace, or have you ever not talked about politics in the workplace? What were the consistent findings that you came up with?
The consistent findings is that situation really put a chill on conversations as it relates to political ideology, policy discussions in the workplace. So if you were very conservative or conservative, you were above 80% less likely to engage in these types of conversations. Moderate, 50% less likely. Even if you were liberal, you were about 30% less likely to engage in these types of conversations. So the snapshot that we got from post-Damore is that the way Google handled that situation caused people to become less open and less willing to discuss these issues.
Now, in one way, that's awful because it's chilling of speech, but in another way, is it maybe a good thing that people aren't talking about politics in the workplace?
It depends on what type of ethos the company encourages it. Google, places like Salesforce, they promote themselves as being environments where they want you to bring your whole self to work. They actively encourage it. They invite speakers to talk about policy or politically oriented topics. And so if that is going to be the ethos and the culture that you create in the company, then you are doing a disservice to a percentage, perhaps a significant percentage of your population who feel that they cannot offer their perspective in the workplace because they're going to be shouted down.
What happens, Silicon Valley is interesting, or a lot of companies in the greater Bay Area, part of their brand, part of their identity, part of their value proposition to customers is that we're not just another company. You can get tech support from any place, but we are interested in helping starving villagers in China, or we are committed to gender diversity, things like that. Is this, can you square this circle, or is it always going to be the fact that certain companies are going to be like, hey, you know what, we are a very liberal or we're a very conservative company, and we don't, you don't fit in here, so you shouldn't work here. Sure. Is there an irresolvable tension in that?
So there is this interesting narrative in Silicon Valley that these companies are saving the world, even if it's, swipe left, swipe right, somehow they're saving the world. So there's that.
Well, that they're repopulating the world.
Well, there you go. That's important as well. So there's that narrative that the industry tries to promote. And they have had a halo effect in many ways over the years because there's this popular sentiment, this positive sentiment as it relates to tech companies. But that's really shifting. You're noticing that in a number of ways. Before, the narrative has always been big financial companies or big telco companies are harming consumers, they're doing bad things, and so they need to be punished, they need to be regulated. But, post 2016 election, the role that the tech companies may have played in inflaming a divisive sort of tribalization in our country, there's a growing sentiment that these tech companies are harming consumers, they're doing bad things, and so we need to take a harder look at what these tech companies are doing and to what extent regulation is needed. So there's a changing dynamic with how the country sees places like Silicon Valley.
So they're kind of becoming now that, Lehman Brothers or something doesn't exist or whatever, Bear Stearns is out of business, we need new villains in the business space, and Google, Facebook, Twitter or might be filling that space.
They might be. It remains to be seen to what extent this odd interest, not only from progressives, but also from conservatives, turns into anything real. Is there antitrust? Is there new regulation? That remains to be seen, but there is skepticism about how much value tech companies are actually bringing to society. Are they harming democracy? Or are they enabling and helping democracy?
So this was a pilot study. It was conducted towards the end of last year with relatively few people. When do you expect to have a fuller kind of set of data or findings?
Short answer is at the end of 2018. Post Damore, when those issues rise to the surface, groups like Lincoln Network, because we're only game in town, we get inundated by journalists who want to know, are things really as bad as everyone is saying? What's the ground level truth? And unfortunately, as I pointed out, there was no data. And so we threw a study together in a very short time frame just to try to get a snapshot of what's really happening, capture some early data. So we plan to, towards the end of this year, after the midterm election, do a larger survey trying to understand have things gotten better, have things gotten worse. We also focused the initial pilot only on Silicon Valley. We were, got a lot of inbound messaging from people in other tech hubs who said they wanted to participate, but they didn't because it was focused only on Silicon Valley. So we want to address a much larger part of the country.
And as a final point, can you talk a little bit about Lincoln Network and what you're trying to accomplish with this group?
Yeah, so Lincoln Network is a national community of technology professionals, and we use our technical skill sets to help advance economic and individual liberty. So that means different things. On the policy front, we try to help lawmakers at the local, state, and federal level get up to speed on emerging technologies so they're not standing in the way of the future, but that they are creating policies enabling a more prosperous future for everyone. And then on the technology side, we actually use our skill sets to help government and civic professionals do their jobs better. So we've got, institutions that were created in the 19th century, with regulations that were created in the 20th century, trying to work within a world in the 21st century. So there's a lot of catching up that the government has to do, and we have technology professionals who use their skills to help solve those problems. So we're trying to create a freer and prosperous world by using our skill sets.
Well, I take this for what it's worth, but I hope you let the government, like, don't let the government catch up too much, because I think the only hope for freedom and individual liberty is that we keep a little bit ahead of them.
I think you may be right.
Well, I want to thank you for talking. We've been talking with Garrett Johnson of Lincoln Network. They have a fantastic new survey about political orientation and the way it affects employment and kind of water cooler culture in Silicon Valley. Garrett, thanks for talking.
Thanks for having me.
For Reason, I'm Nick Gillespie.